Did you ever imagine that a single investigation could shake the very foundations of the British monarchy? That someone so close to the royal family, someone trusted, someone perceived as untouchable, could suddenly have their life flipped upside down? That's exactly what happened when King Charles finally took decisive action against Doria Ragland, the mother of Meghan Markle. For years, Doria was not just a mother. She was a symbol of trust, a figure who had been quietly woven into the inner sanctums of royal life. But behind her calm demeanor and polite smile, secrets were lurking, secrets that MI6 had quietly been tracking for months, secrets that would ultimately lead to her royal allowance being slashed and her dismissal from a position many thought was permanent. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It all began with questions few dared to ask. How did Doria Ragland, a woman whose life seemed simple and uncontroversial, end up with direct access to the most powerful family in the world? How did she, seemingly overnight, become the subject of an intelligence investigation, the kind usually reserved for heads of state, international business magnates, or threats to national security? The answer, as shocking as it may sound, is tied to both her past and the enormous stakes of being close to the monarchy. And the revelation that came from MI6? It sent shockwaves not just through Buckingham Palace, but across the world. Doria Ragland had always been portrayed as the gentle, wise mother who supported her daughter Meghan through every public trial. She attended royal weddings, smiled for cameras, and quietly navigated the rarefied world of palaces and power. To the public, she seemed untouchable, even untarnished. But the reality was far more complicated. Every allowance she received, every moment of royal privilege she enjoyed, had been under quiet scrutiny, a scrutiny that, until recently, had been invisible to everyone outside the palace walls. MI6, the United Kingdom's secret intelligence agency, was quietly investigating certain discrepancies in her records. The nature of this investigation would shock even the most seasoned royal watchers. Imagine this: a mother, once celebrated for her presence in the royal sphere, suddenly faced allegations that threatened to erase decades of carefully cultivated respect. Criminal records, previously hidden or unknown, came to light. The documents were thorough, meticulous, and damning. MI6 had traced a trail through past incidents, financial anomalies, and previously unreported associations. Every detail painted a picture that was both complex and troubling. This wasn't about gossip. This wasn't tabloid conjecture. This was intelligence work, fact-checked, cross-referenced, and verified by one of the world's most secretive agencies. And the outcome was something no one anticipated. King Charles, the figurehead of the monarchy, made a decision that would reverberate across royal circles. He cut Doria Ragland's allowance. For some, the act may seem merely financial, a decision about funds, allowances, and fiscal responsibility. But for those who understand the nuances of royal life, it was a symbolic blow. Cutting an allowance is more than just stopping payments. It is an act of severance, a statement of disapproval, a declaration that trust has been broken. And in a family where image, loyalty, and reputation are everything, this was seismic. The move signaled more than financial prudence. It revealed fractures in the royal hierarchy, cracks that had been widening in silence for years. The king's action sent a message to the palace, to Meghan, and to the public. Proximity to power comes with scrutiny, and no one, not even a mother of a royal, is exempt from accountability. Now, you may be wondering, why now? Why at this precise moment did King Charles decide to act? The answer is a combination of timing, revelation, and the relentless pursuit of truth by MI6. The investigation wasn't new. It had been ongoing, quiet, and invisible to the public eye. But recent findings reached a threshold, a critical point where the potential for embarrassment, scandal, or even security risk could no longer be ignored. Internal reports, cross-referenced intelligence, and corroborating evidence painted a portrait of a past that could no longer be ignored. And when it landed on the king's desk, the decision was swift and decisive. Doria Ragland's royal allowance was terminated, and her influence within palace corridors, once assumed permanent, was dramatically curtailed. The impact of this decision is layered. On a personal level, it disrupted Doria's life, her routines, and her relationship with her daughter. Meghan, who had long relied on her mother's guidance and presence, suddenly faced a crisis of loyalty and privacy. The emotional stakes are high. But on a larger scale, this event casts a spotlight on the monarchy itself. It raises questions about governance, accountability, and transparency within an institution that traditionally operates behind closed doors. When MI6 is involved, it underscores that the monarchy is not just a family. It is an institution under national scrutiny. And when the head of that institution makes a public yet quiet move like cutting an allowance, the ripples are felt far beyond palace walls. Consider the public reaction. To the average observer, Doria Ragland may have seemed untouchable, almost untarnished by life's messiness. Her demeanor, her grace, and her relationship with Meghan painted a picture of someone immune to scandal. Yet intelligence agencies don't operate on appearances. They operate on facts, evidence, and risk. The public will never see the meetings, the briefings, or the internal debates that led to this decision. They will only witness the aftermath, the headlines, and the ripple effects on social media, which in today's world are as powerful as any official statement. And what happens next is a question that hangs in the air. How will Meghan respond? How will the palace navigate this unprecedented situation? And most importantly, what secrets are still buried that MI6 hasn't yet revealed? Throughout history, royal scandals have always captured the public imagination. From extramarital affairs to financial improprieties, the monarchy has rarely been free from controversy. But rarely has a scandal involved intelligence agencies exposing past criminal records that lead to such immediate consequences. The case of Doria Ragland is unique because it intertwines family, money, secrecy, and national security. It's a story that blends personal betrayal with institutional responsibility. And it forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about loyalty, trust, and the true cost of proximity to power. How much do we really know about those we invite into our most intimate circles? And what happens when those walls are breached by revelations too serious to ignore? As we dive deeper into this story, we will uncover the trajectory of Doria Ragland's life. Her rise to prominence, the moments that brought her closer to royalty, and the missteps that would ultimately lead to her downfall. We will examine the role of MI6, their painstaking investigation, and the intelligence they provided to King Charles. We will explore the reactions of Meghan Markle, Prince Harry, and the inner royal circle, whose lives are inevitably intertwined in this unfolding drama. And perhaps most importantly, we will explore the human dimension of this story. The emotions, the loyalties, the betrayals, and the decisions that forever change relationships and legacies. But before we get there, imagine for a moment being in Doria Ragland's shoes. For years, you navigate the gilded halls of power, quietly trusted, quietly respected. You see your daughter rise to unprecedented fame, navigating challenges and controversies with poise. You enjoy privileges that many could only dream of. And then, in what feels like an instant, your life is upended. Decisions are made about your financial security, your social standing, and your very place within one of the most historic families in the world, all based on secrets you thought were long buried, but which someone else unearthed. That is the moment when trust fractures and everything becomes uncertain. And that is exactly where our story begins. The world is watching. The palace is buzzing behind closed doors. MI6 has spoken, King Charles has acted, and the future of Doria Ragland hangs in the balance. And while headlines may fade, the emotional and institutional consequences of these actions will reverberate for years. The question now becomes, what happens next? How will Doria respond? How will Meghan navigate this family storm? And what other revelations lie waiting in the shadows, ready to change the narrative yet again? The answers to these questions will not only reveal the truth about one woman's journey, but will also offer an unprecedented glimpse into the complex, often hidden world of the monarchy, a world where loyalty, power, and secrecy collide in ways most of us could never imagine. From a quiet neighborhood in California to the glittering corridors of Buckingham Palace, Doria Ragland's journey reads like a storybook, but one with twists, turns, and secrets most of us could never imagine. Few could have predicted that a woman with a relatively private life would one day find herself entwined with the British monarchy. Yet, here she is, a figure who walked among kings and queens, her presence quietly influencing some of the most high-profile moments in modern royal history. But how did she get there? How did Doria, the mother of Meghan Markle, rise from ordinary beginnings to extraordinary proximity to one of the world's most scrutinized families? Doria's early life was grounded, rooted in community, education, and family. Born and raised in Los Angeles, she was known as a compassionate and intelligent woman. She pursued higher education, studied social work, and became deeply involved in helping others. For many, her life was emblematic of dedication, not glamour. She taught yoga, engaged in therapy and wellness, and maintained a steady presence in her community. Those who knew her personally described a woman of calm strength, a steadying presence for those around her. But little did anyone know, the skills she honed in compassion, observation, and discretion would one day be invaluable in navigating the rarefied and often unforgiving world of royalty. The turning point came with her daughter, Meghan. As Meghan's star began to rise, from her acting career to international recognition and eventually her royal marriage, Doria's life changed in ways both subtle and seismic. Suddenly, her world expanded beyond the borders of Los Angeles, extending to international travel, media scrutiny, and high society events. With Meghan's engagement to Prince Harry, Doria was thrust into the public eye. Photographers and reporters who had once overlooked her presence now followed her every move, chronicling her appearances, her wardrobe, and even her gestures at high-profile events. To some, it seemed as if a quiet life had been transformed overnight into a stage for global observation. Despite this newfound attention, Doria's approach was characteristically understated. She avoided overexposure, did not give frequent interviews, and maintained a poised, calm demeanor in the face of intense media interest. This discretion earned her a reputation as a woman who could navigate the pressures of public life without losing her composure, a trait highly valued in royal circles. Those within the palace recognized her ability to handle scrutiny with grace, her careful observations, and her loyalty to Meghan. It's one thing to be a mother. It's another to seamlessly adapt to a world where every glance, every comment, and every action is analyzed, dissected, and debated. Doria did it with a quiet mastery. Her appearances at key royal events marked her gradual integration into the royal sphere. At the 2018 wedding of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, she walked with dignity, her presence a visible testament to the maternal support that had guided Meghan through life's challenges. Photographers captured her expressions, sometimes tender, sometimes reserved, painting her as both a public figure and a private anchor. To the world, she was the supportive mother, a symbol of family stability amidst the whirlwind of royal pomp and circumstance. Yet beneath the surface, the palace began to notice the influence she wielded, not through formal titles, but through subtle guidance, the shaping of public narratives, and the emotional support of her daughter, who now carried the weight of royal expectations. But as Doria's proximity to the monarchy increased, so did the scrutiny. Proximity to power comes with invisible strings, unwritten expectations, and, occasionally, quiet suspicion. The palace, while appreciative of her discretion, began to observe her with the same meticulous attention afforded to anyone who enters the orbit of royalty. Loyalty is prized in royal life, but it is also tested. Even a mother's influence, once seen as benign, can become a point of tension when intelligence agencies, advisors, and the monarchy itself begin to evaluate the implications of her presence. And Doria, despite her best efforts to maintain privacy, could not escape the careful gaze of those whose responsibility it is to protect the family, the finances, and the reputation of the monarchy. It's important to recognize that Doria's rise was not simply a matter of luck or circumstance. She possessed traits that made her both admirable and, unintentionally, a figure of intrigue. Her intelligence, discretion, and calm under pressure allowed her to navigate events that would have unsettled many. She was invited to private royal gatherings, witnessed ceremonies that few outside the inner circle could attend, and offered advice, both emotional and practical, to her daughter. Her counsel, though informal, carried weight. Advisors, aides, and even members of the royal family noted her insight, her ability to observe without judgment, and her capacity to provide Meghan with clarity amidst the chaos of royal life. It is perhaps this very skill, the ability to see without being seen, that drew both admiration and quiet suspicion from those tasked with monitoring the palace's inner workings. And yet, for all her accomplishments, Doria remained remarkably grounded. She did not seek titles, honors, or public accolades. Her life was, in many ways, still anchored in the principles she had long valued: family, service, and integrity. She engaged in charity work, wellness initiatives, and community programs, reflecting the values that had defined her long before the royal spotlight found her. This balance between public visibility and personal authenticity only increased the fascination surrounding her. To the public, she seemed untouchable, a figure whose life combined the ordinary with the extraordinary. To the palace, she was an enigmatic presence, trustworthy yet untested in matters of absolute discretion, influence, and loyalty under pressure. As her visibility increased, so too did speculation. Media outlets, bloggers, and social commentators began to analyze her every move, looking for signs of impropriety, hidden agendas, or undue influence. Headlines often painted her as a supportive figure, yet whispers of mystery surrounded her past. Questions about her career, personal associations, and financial history began to circulate in hushed tones. While nothing had yet been proven, the very nature of proximity to power meant that her life would always be subjected to scrutiny. And scrutiny, as we know, can sometimes unearth details that those involved would rather remain buried. It's precisely this intersection of public admiration and private curiosity that set the stage for what was to come. A stage that MI6 would later enter, unraveling threads no one outside the palace had anticipated. By the time King Charles and his advisors were observing Doria's interactions with Meghan, her influence, while subtle, had become impossible to ignore. The intelligence briefings, the internal discussions, and the quiet watchfulness of security and advisors all painted a picture of a woman who had risen from ordinary beginnings to a position of extraordinary proximity. The question, unspoken but ever present, became, how secure is her position, and how much risk does her past pose to the present? Royal life is unforgiving, and the higher one climbs, the more visible the shadows become. And in Doria's case, those shadows would eventually catch up to her, leading to revelations that would shock even those who thought they knew her best. This chapter of her life, the rise to royal fame, is crucial for understanding the drama that follows. It is not merely a story of a mother accompanying her daughter. It is a story of trust, influence, and the quiet power that comes from being in the right place at the right time, while possessing the traits necessary to navigate a world few outsiders will ever see. But as her rise continued, unseen eyes were taking note, recording, analyzing, and ultimately preparing for the moment when private pasts would meet public expectation. Doria's journey, as remarkable as it was, contained the seeds of tension, the kind that, once sprouted, could upend the lives of everyone involved, including the monarchy itself. And as Doria navigated her newfound fame, enjoying events, privileges, and visibility, she remained unaware of the silent, methodical work happening behind the scenes. Intelligence agencies, palace advisors, and security personnel were quietly examining her life, tracing connections, reviewing records, and looking for inconsistencies. The aim was not personal attack. It was precaution, due diligence, and protection of the monarchy. Yet this quiet scrutiny would eventually lead to the moment that changed everything. The exposure of hidden records, the intervention of MI6, and King Charles's decisive action to cut her allowance. It was a moment that no one, not even Doria, could have anticipated when she first began her journey from quiet Californian life to the heart of the British royal family. The story of Doria Ragland's rise is not just a tale of social ascent. It is a prelude to a larger drama that intertwines family, power, secrecy, and betrayal. It sets the stage for revelations that will challenge our understanding of loyalty, trust, and the consequences of proximity to power. And while the world may admire her poise and her achievements, the reality is that every rise carries risk, and every moment of privilege carries the potential for exposure, scandal, and profound consequence. Money, power, privilege. In the royal world, they are inseparable, but they are also tightly controlled, monitored, and rarely discussed in public. Few understand the mechanics of the royal allowance system, yet it is the lifeblood of the monarchy, dictating not just how money flows, but who wields influence and who can be trusted. For Doria Ragland, her allowance represented more than cash. It symbolized access, trust, and acceptance into one of the most exclusive families on the planet. And it is precisely this allowance that would later become the instrument through which King Charles made one of the most consequential decisions of his reign. So how does the royal allowance system work? At its core, it is designed to provide financial support to members of the royal family and select affiliates, enabling them to perform their duties without undue personal expense. But unlike a paycheck or government grant, it is layered with conditions, oversight, and the silent expectation of discretion. For Doria, the allowance was both generous and symbolic. It allowed her to maintain a lifestyle consistent with royal proximity, travel to high-profile events, live in accommodations befitting her position, and attend ceremonies alongside her daughter, Meghan. But it also represented something far subtler, the trust of the monarchy. By providing an allowance, the royal family was not merely giving money. They were signaling confidence, acknowledging her role in the family, and implicitly endorsing her behavior and character. In essence, an allowance in the royal context is a form of currency in the currency of trust. Lose it, and your standing is no longer secure. Keep it, and your influence continues to grow. Understanding the significance of this allowance requires recognizing the stakes involved. Unlike most households, where financial disputes might remain private or confined to family members, in the palace, every transaction can have implications far beyond the individual. Advisors monitor spending patterns for signs of impropriety, intelligence agencies review affiliations, and the senior royals are keenly aware that money can be a vector for scandal. Every allowance carries with it a silent promise. Behave responsibly, maintain discretion, and contribute to the family's image and interests. Fail, and the consequences can be swift, severe, and very public. It is precisely this silent expectation that put Doria in a precarious position. For years, her behavior had been deemed exemplary. She navigated public appearances with grace, maintained a low profile in media interactions, and provided her daughter with steady support. In return, she received her allowance, which enabled her to participate fully in royal life. But as with any system dependent on trust, the potential for scrutiny is ever present. Behind the polished surface, palace officials and MI6 operatives were quietly compiling information, ensuring that her past, present, and potential future conduct aligned with the standards expected of those entrusted with royal privileges. The mechanics of the allowance are fascinating. It is not merely a one-time payment. It is an ongoing financial relationship, contingent upon a combination of factors: behavior, trustworthiness, public perception, and risk assessment. For Doria, each interaction, every attendance at public events, and even her associations outside the palace were being evaluated. Advisors would prepare reports detailing expenditures, interactions, and any anomalies. These reports, while confidential, could influence decisions about the continuation, adjustment, or termination of her allowance. It is a world where financial oversight intersects with personal evaluation, a world where privilege is conditional and loyalty is continuously assessed. Consider the implications. In such a system, even minor discrepancies or previously overlooked incidents can have magnified consequences. A late disclosure, a misjudged interaction, or an unvetted association can trigger scrutiny. And when the intelligence agencies become involved, what might seem trivial to an outsider can suddenly take on enormous significance. For Doria Ragland, the allowance system, which once symbolized acceptance and trust, would ultimately become the tool through which King Charles exercised authority and made a definitive judgment about her standing within the family. The allowance also had a public dimension. Royal finances are a topic of constant interest, with journalists, analysts, and the public eager to understand who receives what and why. Doria's allowance, while private, was indirectly tied to public funds and scrutiny. Any irregularities, perceived or real, could attract intense media attention. This duality, being both private and publicly significant, added pressure to every decision, every expenditure, and every interaction she engaged in. The palace operates on optics as much as reality, and an allowance is as much about perception as it is about practicality. It is worth noting that the royal allowance system has evolved over centuries. In earlier times, allowances were often tied to feudal obligations or ceremonial duties, but modern practices have codified these payments with oversight, accountability, and legal frameworks. The system is not immune to controversy, however. Allowances to peripheral figures, extended family members, or those with non-traditional roles have frequently sparked debate. Critics argue that public money should not support those without official duties, while supporters maintain that allowances enable necessary engagement, loyalty, and familial support. For Doria, this tension would become very real, placing her at the intersection of public opinion, royal expectations, and intelligent scrutiny. But it wasn't just about money. The allowance was, in many ways, a lifeline, a connection that reinforced her legitimacy, her position, and her ability to act as a stabilizing force in Meghan's life. Losing it would mean more than a financial adjustment. It would signal a fracture in trust, a reevaluation of her place in royal life, and potentially a shift in family dynamics. King Charles's decision to cut the allowance was not made lightly. It reflected careful consideration of facts, risk assessments, and the intelligence that had been quietly gathered. The move was as much about protecting the monarchy as it was about addressing past concerns regarding Doria's background. The palace operates in a world where image, loyalty, and discretion are paramount, and financial decisions serve as indicators of all three. By cutting an allowance, the king communicated something unambiguous. Privileges are earned and maintained through trust, and breaches, real or perceived, have consequences. For Doria Ragland, this was not merely a loss of money. It was a recalibration of her influence, a public and private acknowledgement that her past and present would no longer be considered beyond reproach. And as the world would soon see, this decision was only the beginning of a series of revelations that would reshape perceptions of loyalty, family, and responsibility within the monarchy. The intricacies of this system are also illuminated by the involvement of advisors, auditors, and intelligence operatives. MI6, in particular, plays a crucial role when questions of security, integrity, or undisclosed information arise. For someone like Doria, whose life outside the palace intersected with multiple social, professional, and financial spheres, the potential for hidden risks was significant. Intelligence agencies do not operate on rumor. They rely on evidence, verification, and cross-referencing. This methodical, patient scrutiny ensures that when action is taken, it is justified, defensible, and, most importantly, unavoidable. And when the results of these investigations reached King Charles, the decision to cut Doria's allowance became not just a financial matter, but a statement of authority, discernment, and caution. What makes this moment even more compelling is the human element. Imagine being in Doria's shoes, unaware that each decision, each contact, each association is quietly under examination. The allowance, which once represented trust and inclusion, becomes a barometer of your standing, your reputation, and your security within the palace. The cut was not simply a transaction. It was a seismic event, signaling a shift in perception, influence, and the nature of her relationship with the royal family. It is a moment that underscores the fragility of privilege in a world where history, perception, and intelligence intersect in ways few can anticipate. By exploring the inner workings of the royal allowance system, we gain a deeper understanding of the stakes involved. This is not a simple story of money changing hands. It is a story of trust, loyalty, and the delicate balance between private life and public expectation. It is a story of how a mother's role, once celebrated, can be quietly reevaluated by those entrusted with protecting the monarchy. And it is a story of how one decision, cutting an allowance, can send shockwaves through relationships, public perception, and the very foundations of royal privilege. As the palace prepared to act on MI6's findings, the allowance system became the instrument of consequence. Doria Ragland, who had navigated royal life with grace and discretion, now faced the stark reality that proximity to power comes with scrutiny, responsibility, and the constant risk of exposure. The stage was set for the next act in this unfolding drama, one that would intertwine her past, her influence, and her future in ways that would shock both the family and the public. Every story of privilege has its shadows, and Doria Ragland's journey into the royal sphere was no exception. For years, she was celebrated as the calm, composed mother of Meghan Markle, quietly supportive yet publicly admirable. But in the rarefied world of royalty, no one escapes scrutiny forever. Whispers began circulating, first faint, almost imperceptible, then louder, persistent, and impossible to ignore. These were the first rumors of trouble, and they would mark the beginning of a chain reaction that no one, not even Doria herself, could have foreseen. The whispers started quietly within palace circles. Advisors, staff, and even distant relatives began noticing minor inconsistencies, small anomalies that, at first glance, seemed trivial. A reference to a prior job that didn't quite match official records. A financial transaction that lacked a clear explanation. A connection to individuals whose reputations were questionable. Taken alone, none of these details would have been alarming. But in the palace, where history, reputation, and optics are everything, even the smallest discrepancy can spark investigation. And as Doria's visibility increased, the palace's sensitivity to her every move did as well. It is important to understand how such rumors gain traction. In an environment like Buckingham Palace, rumors rarely stay idle. Every anecdote, every subtle observation is recorded, discussed, and cross-checked. Intelligence is collected not for gossip, but for protection. Of the monarchy, its finances, and its public image. Staff members, from security to personal assistants, often report anything unusual, however minor it may seem. The cumulative effect is that even faint whispers can grow into a substantial dossier. And for Doria, this is exactly what began to happen. The first public rumors were subtle. Social media began buzzing with questions about her past. Bloggers and commentators speculated, some in jest, some with the conviction of supposed insider knowledge. Headlines hinted at discrepancies without specifics. Questions arise over Meghan's mother, past records raise eyebrows, and royal insider notes curiosities. While the public only saw vague insinuations, within the palace, these whispers carried weight. Even a single unfounded rumor, if paired with intelligence findings or staff observations, could trigger deeper scrutiny. Meanwhile, Doria herself remained largely unaware of the growing storm. She continued her routine, supporting Meghan, attending events, and maintaining a poised public image. From the outside, she appeared untouchable. To her friends and associates, nothing seemed amiss. Yet, the machinery of the palace had already begun quietly tracking her activities. Advisors flagged unusual associations, financial auditors reviewed past transactions, and intelligence personnel began preliminary checks. It was a process that combined caution with discretion, designed to uncover whether the whispers had substance or were merely idle speculation. The timing of these rumors was also significant. Meghan's rising prominence had brought unprecedented scrutiny to everyone connected to her. Media outlets and the public were intensely interested in family backgrounds, histories, and connections. Any minor inconsistency in Doria's past became fodder for speculation. What had been private suddenly became public, and private actions, years before her entry into the royal spotlight, were now evaluated under the harsh glare of expectation and curiosity. One particularly sensitive area involved financial transparency. Questions were raised about certain allowances and the sources of funds for property and travel. While these were technicalities in many ways, the optics were severe. Advisors understood that in a monarchy where public perception is paramount, even administrative oversights could be construed as impropriety. Rumors began linking these technical anomalies to larger suspicions. Was Doria's background as pristine as it seemed? Were there aspects of her past that could create vulnerability for the royal family? Compounding the situation was the media's insatiable appetite for drama. Journalists are trained to identify patterns, connect dots, and frame narratives that attract attention. The combination of subtle palace whispers, minor inconsistencies, and Doria's elevated profile created a perfect storm. Headlines, whether grounded in fact or suggestion, began circulating internationally. It was an environment where perception often outweighed reality, and where rumors, once started, took on a life of their own. Inside the palace, staff reactions varied. Some were cautious, preferring to observe and document rather than act prematurely. Others were more alarmed, sensing that even small issues could escalate into public scandal. Meetings were quietly held to discuss patterns, timelines, and potential risks. Advisors weighed loyalty against caution, public image against private conduct. Doria, who had once been celebrated as an uncontroversial figure, was now being evaluated under a microscope she did not even know existed. These early rumors also had a psychological impact. The palace is a world of intricate relationships and delicate egos. The very existence of speculation can influence behavior. Staff members who once admired Doria's grace might begin to second-guess her intentions. Even Meghan, despite her confidence, began to encounter subtle pressures, questions about her mother's history, veiled comments during private meetings, and inquiries that seemed routine but carried weight. The emotional stakes were rising, and the rumor mill was accelerating the tension. What makes this moment critical is that rumors, while often dismissed publicly, serve as the first warning signs in a larger investigative process. For Doria, they were a precursor to a more systematic scrutiny, one that would involve intelligence agencies, detailed record checks, and cross-referencing that few outsiders could imagine. The whispers that began as minor palace chatter eventually became evidence that demanded attention. And in a system where trust is currency, even a hint of impropriety can have outsized consequences. Some of the most troubling whispers touched on aspects of Doria's past that were previously unknown or unexamined by palace personnel. Reports surfaced of minor legal entanglements from decades prior, discrepancies in employment records, and associations that, while perhaps innocuous on their own, were deemed risky in the context of royal scrutiny. Intelligence teams began compiling dossiers, cross-checking public records, private archives, and interviews with associates. The goal was not sensationalism, it was risk mitigation. In the monarchy, even a single misstep by someone in close proximity to the royal family can become a national story, a political issue, or a security concern. Meanwhile, Doria continued to embody her public persona, composed, supportive, and dignified. She attended charity events, traveled with Meghan, and maintained the calm aura that had defined her rise. To the public, everything appeared normal. But behind the palace walls, the machinery of investigation had already started turning. Intelligence analysts documented associations, advisors prepared briefings, and King Charles received preliminary reports. The rumors, once faint and private, had matured into an undeniable signal that something warranted attention. The irony of these first rumors is striking. Doria Ragland had spent decades cultivating a life of integrity and service, yet it was precisely this visibility and her proximity to royalty that made her vulnerable. In the world of the monarchy, personal history, however distant, is never entirely private. And as these early signs of trouble grew louder, the stage was set for the moment when minor whispers would crystallize into actionable intelligence, a moment that would ultimately lead to MI6's involvement and the dramatic decision by King Charles to cut her allowance. By tracing the origin and escalation of these initial rumors, we begin to understand the fragile balance of trust, perception, and influence within the royal family. It's a world where whispers can ignite investigations, where minor discrepancies can escalate into headline-making revelations, and where every action, past and present, is subject to scrutiny. Doria Ragland's journey from quiet supporter to central figure in palace intrigue illustrates the power of proximity to royalty, the fragility of trust, and the inevitability of scrutiny. And just as these rumors began to solidify, an unexpected development occurred. Intelligence agencies, always alert to potential vulnerabilities, noticed patterns that were too consistent to ignore. They began digging deeper, systematically reviewing records that had previously been considered routine. What they uncovered would change the trajectory of the story, transforming palace whispers into undeniable evidence, and setting the stage for a confrontation that no one outside the inner circle could have predicted. When whispers of trouble begin to circle, it is one thing for palace staff to take note. It is quite another for MI6, the United Kingdom's elite intelligence agency, to step in. Known for their discretion, meticulous investigations, and access to a labyrinth of records both public and private, MI6 operates in the shadows, ensuring the security of the nation and, by extension, the monarchy. For Doria Ragland, the entry of MI6 into her life was both unprecedented and ominous. The same agency that protects the nation from external threats was now scrutinizing a woman who had, until recently, been viewed as a private citizen with exceptional proximity to the royal family. The process began quietly, as is typical with intelligence operations. Analysts reviewed her known associations, her public history, and financial records, looking for inconsistencies or potential risks. They traced timelines, cross-referenced locations, and examined connections that might have seemed irrelevant to an outsider, but were critical to those charged with safeguarding the monarchy. It was meticulous work. Every employment history, every legal record, and every transaction was evaluated for relevance. This is how intelligence agencies operate. They do not rely on speculation. They rely on documented evidence, verification, and thorough analysis. What made this investigation particularly delicate was Doria's unique position. She was not an employee of the monarchy, nor did she hold a formal royal title. Yet her access and influence were undeniable. She attended private events, was present at ceremonies reserved for the inner circle, and offered personal guidance to Meghan. Her proximity meant that any potential vulnerability could have implications far beyond personal reputation. It could affect security, financial oversight, and the monarchy's public image. MI6 understood that risk assessment in her case was not theoretical. It was practical, immediate, and critical. The initial findings were subtle but alarming. Certain inconsistencies in her records, financial, legal, and social, warranted further investigation. While nothing initially indicated criminal intent, the patterns raised questions about transparency, accountability, and potential exposure. The intelligence operatives, trained to follow threads wherever they lead, began a deeper investigation, consulting historical records, interviewing contacts discreetly, and compiling a comprehensive dossier. Each new detail was carefully verified, cross-checked, and evaluated. In the world of MI6, speculation has no place. Only verified evidence determines action. It is important to note the psychological impact of MI6's scrutiny. For someone like Doria, unaware of the invisible web being woven around her life, the investigation would have felt almost surreal had she known. Everything from prior employment to financial transactions, even minor interactions, was examined under a lens few civilians could imagine. Intelligence teams are trained to detect anomalies, assess potential risks, and predict outcomes in ways that ensure the monarchy is protected. In other words, the quiet diligence of MI6 was not personal, it was operational. But operational scrutiny often feels personal when it intersects with family, privilege, and trust. The investigation also highlighted the contrast between perception and reality. To the public, Doria had always been above reproach, supportive, gracious, and dignified. Her life seemed carefully curated, free from controversy. Yet MI6's work revealed gaps, past incidents, unverified associations, and records that raised questions about her conduct before her integration into royal life. These were not sensational revelations. They were factual findings that needed to be assessed in context. The agency's role was to provide the monarchy with actionable intelligence, ensuring that every potential risk, no matter how small, was addressed before it could escalate. As MI6 delved deeper, the focus shifted from isolated anomalies to patterns of behavior. Analysts examined timelines, connections, and undisclosed activities that, in isolation, might have seemed inconsequential but collectively suggested potential vulnerabilities. These vulnerabilities were not necessarily indicative of wrongdoing, but they created openings that could be exploited, whether by opportunistic individuals, media scrutiny, or even hostile entities. In the high-stakes world of royalty, any vulnerability, however minor, could become magnified into a national issue. The intelligence gathered was then communicated through secure channels to senior palace officials and, ultimately, to King Charles. These briefings were comprehensive, detailing every finding, potential risk, and context. Advisors provided interpretations, assessments, and recommended actions, ensuring that the king could make a fully informed decision. What emerges from this process is the extraordinary level of oversight applied to those who gain even informal proximity to the monarchy. An allowance, privileges, or informal influence is not merely a courtesy. It is a responsibility that comes under continuous evaluation. For Doria, the significance of MI6's involvement cannot be overstated. It meant that her past, previously overlooked or dismissed as irrelevant, had now become a factor in her present standing. It meant that the monarchy's most trusted guardians had determined there were areas of concern serious enough to warrant formal intelligence review. And it meant that her allowance, her influence, and her place in royal life were now directly tied to the findings of one of the world's most secretive organizations. In short, MI6's entry into the story transformed rumor into verified concern, elevating the stakes beyond personal or familial matters into the realm of institutional oversight. One of the most striking aspects of this phase was the speed and thoroughness with which MI6 operated. Analysts compiled dossiers, corroborated records, and followed every lead with relentless precision. No detail was too small, no connection too remote. They contacted legal authorities, checked civil and criminal records, and reviewed financial transactions spanning decades. The goal was not to punish. It was to protect the monarchy from exposure, embarrassment, or potential threats. Yet, by doing so, they inevitably unearthed information that would later justify decisive action. As the dossier grew, palace officials faced difficult questions. How should the findings be interpreted? Were they indicative of actual risk or merely past behavior irrelevant to current standing? How would public perception react if the information were ever revealed? And most importantly, what was the appropriate action to take? In an institution where optics are as critical as facts, every decision carries immense weight. It is in this environment that King Charles made his determination. A decision that would not only impact Doria financially, but also reshape her role in the royal family. MI6's involvement also serves as a stark reminder of the unique pressures faced by those close to the monarchy. Unlike typical families, where personal histories remain private and allowances are contractual, the monarchy operates under public scrutiny and intelligence oversight. Every association, every past action, every transaction carries the potential for exposure. Doria's rise had been remarkable, but her proximity to Meghan and the palace made her life subject to extraordinary examination. The question now became not whether MI6 would find concerns they had, but what the palace would do with that information. Ultimately, the agency's investigation provided the foundation for King Charles's decision to cut Doria's royal allowance. It was not a reactionary move, nor was it based on rumor. It was a calculated, evidence-based decision informed by verified intelligence. MI6's meticulous work ensured that the palace had an unambiguous picture. Doria's past contained issues significant enough to warrant re-evaluation of her privileges, her access, and her influence. For the first time, what had been whispers and speculation became formal, documented evidence that demanded action. This moment marked a turning point in Doria Ragland's journey. From quiet supporter to central figure in palace scrutiny, she had now entered a realm where her past would collide with her present, and where every decision, financial, social, and personal, would be assessed under the most exacting standards. MI6's involvement transformed the story from private rumor into public consequence, setting the stage for a confrontation that would change the course of her relationship with the monarchy. And as the intelligence findings reached the king, one fact became abundantly clear. The next move would be decisive, irrevocable, and far-reaching. The moment of revelation arrived quietly, but with seismic impact. After weeks of meticulous investigation, MI6 compiled a dossier that left little room for interpretation. What had begun as subtle whispers and minor inconsistencies had coalesced into a documented record of surprising, and in some cases alarming, findings about Doria Ragland's past. For King Charles, advisors, and palace officials, the contents of the report were more than intriguing. They were actionable. And for Doria, the eventual exposure of these findings would alter her position within the royal family in ways she could never have anticipated. The dossier contained three primary areas of concern. First, there were discrepancies in her historical employment records. While she had long been celebrated as a dedicated social worker, yoga instructor, and wellness advocate, certain positions she had claimed in the past were either misrepresented, unverifiable, or involved associations with individuals whose reputations were questionable. On the surface, these may have seemed like administrative errors, but within the palace's framework, they indicated a potential pattern of omissions or misstatements. In the highly scrutinized world of royalty, even minor misrepresentation can carry enormous consequences. The second area involved legal entanglements. MI6 uncovered records suggesting involvement in disputes that, while resolved, were never fully disclosed publicly. Some of these incidents were mundane, involving minor financial disagreements or contractual disputes, yet the mere fact that they had not been revealed raised alarms. In the monarchy, undisclosed legal matters, even from decades prior, can be interpreted as vulnerabilities. Advisors worried that any discovery by external media or investigative journalists could be spun into scandal, creating a situation where Doria's presence in the royal sphere would no longer be tenable. Perhaps most startling were findings related to financial connections and transactions. MI6 discovered patterns of monetary activity that, while not illegal, were unusual for someone in her position. Transfers, property dealings, and associations with certain individuals suggested access to funds or networks outside what was publicly acknowledged. These findings were never presented as evidence of wrongdoing, yet they were treated as potential risk factors. In the monarchy, risk is often as significant as proof, and the intelligence team emphasized that perception can be as damaging as reality. What makes this phase of the story particularly compelling is the combination of timing, visibility, and context. Doria had been integrated into royal life for years without incident. Her public appearances, her support of Meghan, and her calm, dignified presence had all contributed to the perception of a reliable, trustworthy figure. Yet MI6's detailed review illuminated hidden complexities that had remained unnoticed or unexamined until now. It was a stark reminder that proximity to power carries scrutiny at all levels, and that even the most respected figures are never entirely outside the reach of evaluation. The findings also revealed subtle contradictions in her personal narrative. Interviews with colleagues, neighbors, and associates uncovered small discrepancies in accounts of past roles, achievements, and interactions. To a casual observer, these might have seemed inconsequential. To MI6 and palace advisors, however, they formed a pattern that could not be ignored. The agency's role is not to judge character, but to assess risk, and the dossier's conclusions were framed in terms of potential exposure, reputational damage, and financial transparency. These were metrics the monarchy could not dismiss lightly. One of the more controversial revelations concerned past associations with individuals who had legally or ethically questionable reputations. While no evidence suggested Doria herself had engaged in illegal activity, her connections raised red flags. In the palace, associations matter as much as actions. Even indirect links can create vulnerabilities, especially when someone occupies a position of informal influence near the heir to the throne. MI6 highlighted these connections not as accusations, but as cautionary notes, emphasizing how external perception and potential exploitation could pose risks to the monarchy. The report was delivered to King Charles with utmost discretion. Advisors outlined the evidence, contextualized the findings, and presented recommendations. The mood was grave but professional. This was not about personal judgment, but about institutional protection. The dossier made one thing abundantly clear: Doria Ragland's history, previously considered private and unobtrusive, contained elements that could no longer be ignored. For the king, the decision that followed would require balancing family loyalty, public perception, and the ongoing integrity of the monarchy. The emotional resonance of this revelation cannot be understated. For palace staff, it was a confirmation that the structures of scrutiny were effective. For advisors, it underscored the delicate balance of trust and oversight in managing extended family members. And for Meghan, had she known the full scope of these findings at the time, it would have been a moment of shock, conflict, and intense concern. A mother's reputation, after all, directly influences the perception of her child in the public eye, especially when that child is married into the royal family. Publicly, nothing had yet changed. Doria continued to appear at events, maintain her public persona, and participate in royal activities. To the outside world, she remained the composed, dignified mother of a duchess. Privately, however, palace advisors began preparing for the next step: how to address these findings without creating immediate scandal, how to reassess her privileges, and how to ensure the monarchy remained insulated from potential fallout. It was a delicate dance, one requiring discretion, legal counsel, and precise timing. The implications of these findings were vast. Beyond the personal impact on Doria, they threatened to create ripples throughout the royal household. Questions arose about oversight, accountability, and the scope of scrutiny applied to those close to the monarchy. Advisors debated the messaging, the timing, and the potential consequences of public disclosure versus internal action. Every option carried risk, and every decision would be interpreted by the public, the media, and political observers. This chapter of Revelation illustrates a fundamental truth of royal life. Proximity to power is a double-edged sword. While it brings access, privileges, and influence, it also invites scrutiny, accountability, and the possibility that past actions, long buried, long forgiven, can be unearthed with consequences that are immediate and far-reaching. For Doria Ragland, the shocking findings were not merely historical. They were present-day catalysts that would redefine her relationship with the monarchy, her financial status, and her personal standing. And as advisors prepared to brief King Charles on the potential courses of action, one fact became unmistakable. In a world governed by trust, discretion, and perception, even a single breach, real or perceived, can trigger a response of monumental impact. The palace had the evidence, the intelligence had verified it, and the stage was set for a decision that would send shockwaves through royal life. In the corridors of power, decisions are rarely instantaneous. They are measured, deliberate, and informed by layers of intelligence, counsel, and consequence. Yet, when the evidence is compelling, when risks are clear, and when trust has been called into question, even a monarch must act decisively. For King Charles, the dossier compiled by MI6 and palace advisors presented such a moment, a convergence of verified findings, reputational risk, and familial responsibility that demanded a resolution. The decision he made would not only affect Doria Ragland financially, but would redefine her standing within the royal family entirely. The king's process was methodical. Advisors first summarized the findings, highlighting areas of concern without exaggeration, while MI6 personnel offered context regarding potential vulnerabilities. Each element of the dossier was cross-checked and verified to eliminate any doubt. For the monarchy, evidence must be irrefutable. Perception alone is insufficient to justify action. King Charles listened, asked pointed questions, and considered the implications from every angle: legal, social, financial, and, importantly, public perception. At the heart of the decision was the royal allowance itself. Unlike a simple stipend or gift, a royal allowance is a symbol of trust, legitimacy, and access. By providing it, the monarchy is implicitly endorsing the recipient's character, reliability, and discretion. In Doria's case, the allowance had been a tacit acknowledgement of her integration into royal life. It enabled her to participate in events, maintain a lifestyle compatible with her proximity to the family, and fulfill duties in support of Meghan. But trust, once undermined, requires action. King Charles understood the stakes. Retaining the allowance in light of MI6's findings would risk ongoing scrutiny, potential media scandal, and erosion of public confidence. Cutting the allowance, however, was equally fraught. It risked personal conflict, familial tension, and the perception of harshness toward a woman whose public persona had been largely positive. Every choice had consequences, and in this rarefied environment, even small miscalculations could magnify into a crisis. The king weighed several options. One was to maintain the allowance but impose stricter oversight. Another was to reduce the allowance incrementally while monitoring Doria's behavior. A third, more decisive option was to terminate the allowance entirely, signaling that trust had been compromised and that privileges tied to royal proximity were no longer justified. After careful deliberation, and with advisors emphasizing both the evidence and the precedent for accountability, King Charles chose the third path. The decision was delivered privately, in a controlled setting, designed to minimize immediate confrontation while maximizing clarity. King Charles conveyed that the allowance, which had symbolized trust and integration, would no longer continue. The language was firm but respectful, emphasizing that this was a consequence of verified findings, not speculation or rumor. In royal protocol, such clarity is essential. Ambiguity invites further questions, and perception is as important as fact. The impact of the decision was immediate, both practical and psychological. For Doria, losing the allowance meant a direct reduction in financial autonomy, but more importantly, it represented a formal acknowledgement that her standing in the royal family had shifted. Privileges once taken for granted, access to events, support networks, and informal influence, were now under reassessment. The allowance was more than money. It was a marker of trust, and its removal was a tangible signal that trust had been eroded. Advisors anticipated various reactions. Publicly, the move was expected to remain private initially, but leaks in royal households are common, intentional or accidental. Staff prepared messaging and contingency plans to address potential media coverage or social commentary. Internally, the palace began recalibrating Doria's access and role in family engagements. Even subtle shifts, who she traveled with, which events she attended, and how she was introduced, were carefully considered to reflect her new status without creating overt conflict or scandal. The decision also sent ripples through Meghan's inner circle. While Meghan herself was fiercely loyal to her mother, the reality of palace scrutiny, MI6 involvement, and the king's authority could not be ignored. Advisors worked to manage the emotional impact on Meghan while reinforcing the necessity of the action for institutional stability. The monarchy operates on dual axes: family and institution, personal and public. King Charles's decision exemplified the need to balance both, ensuring that the personal consequences of action did not compromise the broader integrity of the monarchy. Financially, the cut was significant. Royal allowances are calculated not just for daily expenses, but for lifestyle compatibility with royal standards. Losing the allowance meant adjustments in housing, travel, and participation in events, all of which were historically subsidized or supported. But the more profound effect was symbolic. It marked a formal boundary between privilege and accountability.